Ooh, it's not looking good out here today. What's going on, guys? I am in the middle of trying to finish up this stair tread project that I've been working on for maybe the past 4 weeks on. Oftentimes I get asked, over on Instagram, what HVLP system I use, how to use an HVLP system, and what is my process like. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through the entire finishing process. Okay. The first common question I get is, why use a sprayer over a brush on finishes? Well, I'm sure you've been in a situation where you're applying a finish with a brush and you're left with tons of annoying streaks. Sure, you can add some additives to make it a little bit smoother, and I'm sure I'm not the only one that doesn't really think about the correct brushes to use for the finish application. I mean, let's be honest, we're probably gonna buy the cheapest brush we could find, and it's usually this foam stuff right here. But finishing can definitely be a step that's really frustrating. I mean, you spent all this time to perfect your workpiece, and in the end, the finish just looks like it's done by a kindergartner who had too much candy and skipped nap time. I mean, I'm not sure how that's related, but you get my point. Do they even still give kids nap time? Huh. Ever since I started spraying my finishes, I've never had any issues, and I'm definitely never going to go back to brushing my finishes ever again. All right, so first thing we have to look at is the actual finish itself. If you've ever been to the big box store, you probably noticed that there are tons of finishes out there to choose from. I mean, there's lacquer, polyurethane, polyurethane, shellac. I mean, the list just goes on and on. Not to mention the finished products on the paint side. When it comes to DIYers and hobbyists, it boils down to essentially two factors, whether the finish is oil or water-based. And for the most part, water-based is generally going to be easy to use as well as easy to clean, especially if you're going to spray it through a spray gun. For the sake of time, I won't go into the pros and cons between oil and water-based. Maybe I'll do a separate video for that. Click that like button and then drop a comment down below if you're interested in that type of video. So a good finished product always starts with good prep. Normally I sand my workpiece down from 80 grit to 220 grit before I apply any finish. And then I'll wipe the entire thing down with mineral spirits to remove any of the dust that might settle or hang on the surface. And as I'm sanding, I'm making sure to round over all of my edges. That way it will help the finish stick onto those corners and it won't have any issues later on. For this piece here, I've sanded down to 220 grit already, and I wiped the entire thing down with mineral spirits. That process is really easy. You pretty much just want to wipe the entire thing down with mineral spirits and then just let it dry before you apply your finish. Which leads me to the biggest question that I often get asked, which is, what finish do I typically use? And that really depends on a few factors. What wood am I using? Where is this finished piece of wood going to be located, or finished piece of furniture? And how will it be used? So there are many questions that I ask before I actually pick out a product. For this demonstration, I'm going to use a very common finish, and you could probably buy it at any big box store. This is a water-based polyurethane, and it's relatively inexpensive, and it works really well for probably most of the indoor furnitures that I've built. I would say that this is probably my go-to, probably about 75% of the time for interior projects. If the project were to be outdoors, then I'll probably use something like a spar urethane finish, but this is going to work really great for indoor projects. All right, still a little wet, but I think it'll be okay. Now, when it comes to spraying through an HVLP sprayer, there's two things you really want to consider. One is the air cap set, and also how thick or thin the material actually is. Generally, a larger air cap set, in this case this is a 1.8, it's going to be for thicker materials, usually like paint, latex paints and things of that nature. And the thinner ones will be for more thinner materials. I'm thinking more like polyurethane, lacquer, things like that. And what I typically use is a 1.3 for most of my wood finishes and a 1.8 for all of my painted finishes. For most HVLP sprayers, you'll most likely need to thin out the material. This is because an HVLP sprayer is a low pressure system and it uses a turbine. Let me get my turbine for you. All right, so this thing here is a turbine, and I know it has seen better days. Let me move this over so you can see my face a little bit. This here is my turbine, the Fuji Mini Mite 4. If you do want to pick this up, use the link in the description down below. It does give me a little bit of a kickback. I do recommend this spray here if you're going to do a lot of spraying and you're trying to make money with the products and projects that you're trying to sell. So an HVLP system will use air to atomize the actual material compared to an airless sprayer, which uses a bigger pump and it forces the material through at a higher pressure. I had a few projects where I couldn't put this unit outdoors, which is typically what I would do, because you don't want the turbine sitting inside of the room that you're spraying in because it clogs the filters and it's not good for the machine. But a few days where it was raining, I just had to spray with it indoors, so that's that. Anyways, let's get to mixing. When I'm mixing materials, I often refer to the recommended runout time or viscosity based off of the air cap set as well as the system that I'm using. Each manufacturer should have a chart that you could follow, and that will give you a guide based off of your specific system. For my system, which is the Fuji Mini Mite 4, they recommend about a 17 to 25 second runout time with a number 4 Ford cup. And this is what a number 4 Ford cup looks like. What that would essentially mean is if I were to fill this entire cup with the material that I'm going to spray, it would take about 17 to 25 seconds for the entire thing to empty. And if it takes a little bit longer, then I can just thin it out by adding water in this case because it's a water-based product. If it's an oil-based, then I'll add maybe like a mineral spirit or something, some kind of solvent. But a word of caution when you're mixing solvents, make sure you're just reading the back of the label because you don't want to mix weird products. You don't want to cause a chemical reaction where the entire spray booth just goes up in flames, and that's definitely not the idea here. All right, so you just saw me run a few tests onto this piece of parchment paper here. I want to make sure that I'm getting a nice amount of material onto the surface, but not so much that it starts to run. And I will show you a little bit closer what it looks like when it starts to run. Essentially, you don't want any dripping. Of course, this is going to depend on the workpiece itself. If you're spraying very narrow workpieces, then you want to make sure that your fan is very tight, but sometimes that means more material will be sprayed in one spot. You want to make sure that you dial back the amount of material as well. So let's take a closer look at these spray patterns here. The first two that you saw towards the end over here, as you can see, the beam was very narrow, it's very tight, and that's not really what I want. And then the next spray pattern here, it was a little bit too wide and there was not enough material on the surface. So I adjusted a little bit, add more material and narrowed down the beam, but I narrowed it too much. And as you can see here, there's a little bit of dripping that's happening. For this one right here, I liked the width of it, but the material was a little bit too much, which caused it to drip. And so if we move on to the last two over here, this one, I dialed the material back a little bit too far. There was not enough coverage on the overlap. And then the last one right here, as you can see, it's nicely covered in that overlap and there's not a lot of overspray. So there's just enough material that's getting onto the surface without it being too runny, especially for the verticals. And I'm not getting so much overspray that I'm just wasting materials. So now that everything is dialed in, I'll go ahead and spray the actual piece. For panel projects like doors or trays, I usually spray the edge first and then the faces. This will help with the overspray that might settle on the workpiece, causing the finish not to be as smooth. And as I'm spraying, I'm trying to keep the gun at a consistent distance from the surface, usually about 6 to 12 inches, and I'll try to keep the application speed consistent as well. I'll spray a portion of the piece in one direction, let go of the trigger, reposition, and then spray in the other direction, making sure I have about a 50-50 overlap. Here's what it looks like when you don't have enough material on the surface, and here's what you're trying to go for. The surface should look wet. So I got the first coat sprayed and it's dried, which leads me to the next question that I often get asked is, do I actually need to sand in between coats? And for me personally, I do it all the time. It's the only way I can get really good, smooth results in the end. And let's be honest, no matter how perfect you're gonna try to get it, it's not always gonna be perfect. You're gonna sometimes make mistakes. So sanding between coats will allow me to correct some of the mistakes that I make. That way, whenever I apply the final top coat, it's gonna look perfect. Before I apply the second coat, I'm going to use 220 grit sandpaper to sand the entire thing down to make sure it's nice and smooth once again. That's because water-based finishes typically raise the grain on the wood. So when you're sanding it down in prep, everything is nice and smooth. But now with the water-based finish, once you feel the top of the surface, you'll notice it's a little rough. So the 220 grit is going to make sure everything is nice and smooth once again. That way, when I apply the final top coat, everything is going to be nice and smooth. Sand coat has been applied, it's dried, and what I'm going to do now is to figure out if I need to sand it with 220 once again, or can I go to 320. If there is a bit of raised grain, at this point I'll go with the 220 and then I'll apply the third coat. If it's pretty much smooth, I don't feel any bumps, then I'll go ahead and just use the 320 grit sandpaper to remove any dust or debris that might have settled onto the surface while it was drying. What that will also do is create some small micro scratches on the surface, and that will help the material bond together. Okay, the third coat is on. It's not quite finished and dried just yet, so I'm not going to sand it to apply my fourth and final coat. Which brings me to the next question that I often get asked is, how many coats is actually enough? Well, that's going to really depend on what product you're using as your finish, because some products will require a minimum of 3 coats, minimum of 2 coats, and then some products will only require you to add 1 coat. And also, what level of protection are you needing from your piece of furniture? And generally speaking, the more coats you add, the more protection you're gonna get. For me, when it comes to polyurethane, I'm gonna do about 3 coats. I'm doing a 4th coat because I know that this piece here will receive a lot of traffic. So that final 4th coat will add just a bit more of protection for the entire piece. So pretty much this is done. If I do feel any bumps or any small little debris on the surface, then I would go with a 600 grit sandpaper to just sand it all down, and that should make things nice and smooth. In this case, it feels pretty much perfect, so I'm just gonna leave it at that. So at the end of the project, you might have some leftover material inside of the canister. What you can do is just take the material, dump it into a small little container, and make sure it's nice and sealed up. And then I'll just take a piece of tape and add a note on the top to let me know that this product is polyurethane and it's already been mixed, so I can keep everything nice and organized. All right, so here's the part that we, especially me, hate the most, which is cleaning. And I am notoriously bad at cleaning after myself, just ask my wife. So pretty much what I like to do, especially with these guns here, is with water-based finish, I will fill the entire tank up twice, run it through the entire system, and that should clean up all of the internals to make sure that there's nothing in there that's going to clog up the gun. And I'll just spray it into a bucket. In this case, I only have this cup. Usually I have a larger bucket, I don't know where it is. But I'll spray it in there. I'll make sure that what I'm seeing is very clear. That's how I know the gun's actually clean and I won't have any issues with it later on. Probably like maybe once a month, I will break down the entire gun into all the parts and then clean it thoroughly. With water-based, it's not that big of an issue. If you are gonna spray oil-based products, then yes, you gotta clean it every single time you spray it, because it's gonna clog up and you're gonna have a nightmare just trying to clean it out. So with oil base, I will spray through some kind of solvent like a lacquer thinner or paint thinner, and also I will break down all the parts and clean it internally as well. So if you do have a clog, lacquer thinner is going to help remove all the plastic parts so it doesn't get damaged. Soak it in lacquer thinner and then use a brush to clean everything up, and that should help you with the clogs. But at the end of the day, just clean your equipment and that will help it last a lot longer. All right guys, so that is pretty much for this video. I hope that this has helped you get past some of that frustrating feelings you might get whenever you're going to finish your projects. Honestly, if you're looking to step up your finish, then I highly suggest you get some kind of spray finisher. This video was mainly focused on finishing wood finishes, but if you do want to learn about finishing with paint and spraying paint through an HVLP system, I have this video here for you that goes into my process on spraying latex paint through an HVLP system, as well as using wood filler to cover up plywood edges. As usual guys, hit that like button if you did enjoy this video. Leave a comment down below and share some of your tips and tricks with everybody. I love to learn from you guys and see what you guys are doing so that I can step up my finishing game as well. Until next time guys, this has been Bao with Design Craft Workshop. See ya.